What do Americans really make of President Trump's first 100 days back in office? And I don't just mean what's his personal poll ratings, because for any president, they can go up and down for all sorts of reasons. I mean the big stuff. I mean, we've been covering the rapid onset of autocratic actions, testing legal boundaries, pursuing vendettas, sending people to gulags, frankly, without due process. We've been covering the impact on the world of hitting everyone with tariffs, threatening to take Greenland by force, siding with Russia in the Ukraine war, trying to interfere in other countries' elections by promoting far-right parties, and the dismantling of America's scientific institutions, the censorship of health and climate science that the administration didn't want to know about. All of that. It's easy to sit outside America, where Trump and J.D. Vance and Elon Musk are all seen as almighty fails and dangerous besides, and assume that a sizable chunk of the American people surely agree that those who, for whatever reason, voted for Trump in 2024 are looking around them with a sinking feeling, saying to each other, "What the heck did we just do?" In other words, that Americans are seeing all this much the same as people outside the United States are seeing it. But Americans famously don't take much account of what's happening in the wider world. I mean, to be fair, they're not actually unique in that. Probably every country has a large percentage of insular-looking people, which is an observation, not a criticism. Or at least if it is a criticism, it's a criticism of universal human nature. It's just that America has much more impact on the wider world than any of those other countries. That whole
"with great power comes great responsibility."
So, what are the most recent polls showing on those areas where Trump is pushing the boundaries? The most relevant and most interesting recent responses to the question is from a New York Times Siena College poll published just yesterday. Let's go through the headlines for that. First, overall impressions. There's no doubt that Trump 2.0 is seen as something of a wild ride by many. When they were asked to indicate words that describe Trump's second term so far, 66% said chaotic, 59% scary, and 42% said exciting. Not clear whether that was a good exciting or clinging to the edge of a cliff by your fingernails exciting. Approval of Trump's record so far on specific issues were all pretty much into negative territory, but with large minorities still approving. The specific case of the accidentally deported Kilmar Garcia, that got the worst ratings, 52% disapproving how the administration is handling that, with just 31% approving. That's significantly less support than Trump gets for immigration overall. Maybe a reflection that the Trump team's defense on their refusal to retrieve Garcia, that is not cutting through with the wider population, including those who still support the principle of being tougher on illegal immigration. It's interesting that it's just come to light that when the mistake around Abrego Garcia's transfer to El Salvador first came up, attorneys at the Departments of State, Justice and Homeland Security had urgent discussions about how to get him back quietly and to ensure his safety, which is the sort of normal response you might have expected of people with basic humanity that you would have seen in any previous administration, that the people answering the poll questions would have expected, indeed. You know, we made a mistake. This guy was meant not to be sent back to El Salvador because he was vulnerable to violence from gangs. And oops, we sent him to a brutal prison which happens to be full of the members of gangs. The officials floated the idea of having the US ambassador to El Salvador making a personal appeal to the country's president for his return. But as criticism grew over the case, the White House got directly involved, and that is when the tone completely changed. It became a test case of whether Trump could send people to foreign prisons or not without due process, not a case over a mistake affecting a single man. Now, we'll come to that because the polling also talks about what the administration should or should not have the power to be able to do. But it's an indicator, even in an area that gets more support than most of the others, people still get that what finally emerged in that specific case really wasn't fair to an individual human being. Okay, what else? Similarly poor net approval for how Trump is handling the war in Ukraine. 35% approving, 56% disapproving. Not a surprise, up until yesterday-ish, every president and every opposition figure believed in supporting invaded countries, not invading, and especially not invading dictatorial countries. Trump and the MAGA wing of the GOP may be able to flick that logic on its head in a heartbeat. Most people are not going to be able to follow, at least not so quickly. The disapproval is high as well for how he's handling foreign conflicts generally. The Trump Gaza Riviera plan didn't cut through for some reason, it seems. Trade with other countries, down 42% approval versus 53% disapproval. This is, of course, before the expected ground-level consequences of all those tariff policies start to be felt in earnest by the population. And Trump's management of the economy, 12 points underwater. This was formerly his strongest asset. No longer. Managing the federal government is just 8 points underwater, which seems pretty even, frankly, considering. But in some ways, I think it's a reflection of how much any of these issues are cutting through into Trump's own support base. Because as we know, America is deeply polarized. So normally maybe you could take a starting point for any question of about 48 to 48 on each side. And you'll only see significant disapproval if firstly the independents have pitched strongly against it. And then for the deeper holes, a significant number of the supporters don't like it either. So the base here is a lot about how Doge is cutting waste and fraud. And if you're in a media bubble that only tells you that that's the story and it's going really well, well, yes, why wouldn't you think that represents a pretty good outcome? Trump gets his best figures, of course, on immigration, which is underwater just by 4 points. Not a surprise, more than anything else, it's what he was elected to do. And reducing the number of people crossing the southern border, certainly something that he has definitely achieved. The next round of questions went to the heart of how much Americans are noticing and indeed caring about some of the moves towards authoritarian control by the presidency. Do you think the President of the United States should or should not be able to do each of the following? At the most extreme end, ignore Supreme Court rulings. 76% of people are very clear the President should not be ignoring Supreme Court rulings. 6% are just fine with that, and 15% are not quite sure. So put those two together, I'm taking that 21% as being the core MAGA red in tooth and claw vote. My totally untestable prediction is that if it were a Democrat currently sitting in the White House, the numbers might not change much, but the identity of the people who voted yes would definitely be completely different. Anyway, next question. Should the president be able to send US citizens to prison in El Salvador? Again, 73% of people say no, 10% say yes, 14% not sure. Now be clear, that's US citizens, not illegal immigrant gang members. The United States has prisons. The only reason to send people to a prison in El Salvador is that it enables them to be kept in conditions so brutal and inhumane that American law would prohibit it. You know, because of those fabled American values. Good that 73% of people wouldn't sign up to that, but you have to ask that 24%. It would be good if those people were never put in charge of the country, and oops, too late. Should the president be able to deport legal immigrants who have protested Israel? Note, protested Israel, not campaigned in favour of a terrorist group like Hamas. 63% say no, good solid majority, but now up to 33% saying yes or not sure. That's the We're just kidding about that free speech thing contingent. Then we have eliminate government programs enacted by Congress. 54% say no, 21% yes, 22% undecided. Grant legal status to undocumented immigrants or illegal immigrants, 53 and 24% respectively. And then this one will get to be a lot more topical in the weeks to come. Impose tariffs without authorization from Congress. 61% say no, 28% yes. This is the question. Should the United States President have the power to make the entire world poorer on a whim if he has an eccentric and long discredited idea about how tariffs work? Quite a few people are saying sure here, albeit that a solid majority does not agree. The only one that has a majority for it is that 41% think the president should be able to forgive student debt, versus 37% against. That figure possibly distorted by the student vote amongst the respondees to the poll, you might speculate. There's no doubt these figures represent unease and disapproval with many of the ways Trump is overreaching in terms of the bound of the power of the presidency. They don't, however, exactly scream the "oh my God, there's a dictator in charge" sentiment that a lot of outsiders to the United States have been expressing. But is this just typical bias? This is a poll carried out by a respected firm, but it's with the New York Times, and MAGA supporters will probably just dismiss it as fake news. Well, let's have a look and see what polling the president's favourite, Fox News, has been carrying out. Well, they published a poll 3 days ago with approval figures on a range of issues. And you can tell it's bad when you look at the subtitle, which seems to be trying desperately to put on a positive spin. 82% are extremely or very concerned about inflation, it says. Well, that sounds bad, but relax, because that's down from 89% in January. Okay, so the poll in detail finds most support, positive numbers, for Trump's performance on border security. 55% approve, over 40% disapprove. Everything else is underwater. Worst of all, inflation and tariffs. Not much better on taxes and the economy. Pretty abysmal on foreign policy. Very neutral on guns. Has Trump done anything on guns? Then minor disapproval ratios for deportations, immigration, and slightly worse on overall job performance. Republican pollster Darren Shaw tried to spin the results as best he could, and he said this: as we've moved from one administration to another, and the Trump administration tries to find its footing, many still see our leaders as unresponsive to their main concerns. Tries to find their footing? I think most observers noticed that, they were out of the traps like an amphetamine-fueled greyhound. Goodness only knows what they'll be like when they find their footing. So just a couple of observations to make. One, as I've referred to already in this video, the US has become deeply polarized, and the two most active extremes on each side have largely retreated into very actively self-enforced echo chambers. So it shouldn't be a surprise that there's a robust core on each side that barely notices bad news that affects their side. So those of us who would expect polling to suddenly show up with overwhelming evidence of buyer's remorse from everyone who voted for Trump, no, that's not going to happen. Now interpret that information however you will. Are these people trapped in an information ecosystem, or are they deeply culpable for what they've unleashed on the world? People will have very strong views either way. Secondly, while Americans are clearly noticing and are uneasy about the overreaching powers, there's no indication at this stage that that alone is going to be enough to tip a large number of people into the scale of revolt you would need to guarantee, for instance, that the midterm elections would deliver a decisive corrective. All of this is being done in the absence of any particular visibility from the opposition, the Democrats' party, and whether they put up an effective opposition with credible leadership that reaches out to the centre, or whether they blow it with campaign messages that fail to land or even work against them. That is an unknown in that equation, and it is a rather important one. And yes, you might think that surely any opposition should be getting preference compared to authoritarianism. Personally, I would always say that if you have a choice between two candidates, regardless of the politics involved, one supports democracy and elections and the rule of law, and the other one says, if I lose, it must have been fraud, I would pretty much always vote for the one who supports democracy, even if I have to hold my nose to do so. Because at least if they're terrible, you can get rid of them 4 years later, as you're supposed to be able to. But that is not how the broad base of the US electorate saw the choices in 2024. And it's not as though the Democrats didn't spend quite a bit of their time banging on about it, but they had lost the credibility to do so, for whatever reason. And so, hard though it may be to imagine it, it doesn't seem to be the lens through which the majority of Americans are currently viewing events from the last 100 days. Will that change? Well, sure, probably. I mean, if we're 100 days in, that means there's 1,360-ish more to go. A lot can happen in that time. In fact, we don't know what it will be, but I think we can pretty much guarantee that a lot will happen in that time. And we have some tricky moments built into the timeline, tricky for Trump. The midterm elections will be a decisive moment. However powerful Trump looks right now, a big pushback for the GOP in those elections would change the dynamic completely. The new energetic form of Trumpism will be perceived to have failed, and that will reduce Trump's ability to manipulate what happens next within the party, even to argue that he should get a third term. If the elections go better than expected for the GOP, then Trumpism will be a force in the land for quite some time to come. In that case, the fight then over who takes the mantle of Trump's successor, or even whether it becomes about whether he can find a way to stand himself again, and if he does, will people vote for that? And will the vote be fair even if they don't? Well, all of that could get very lively. And yes, the word lively is a euphemism in that sentence. The one thing I can say, rather presumptuously speaking, for all non-Americans, is that we looked at the choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden and almost universally thought, really, America, is this the best you could come up with? The nature of the choice next time seems likely to be a lot more important, because everybody surely understands that the last 100 days have raised the stakes for the whole world on just what America decides to accept as sufficient material for its next president.